Okay. So what I'd like to do now is I want to go through and I want to take the iUser utility and I want to implement it on our SQL user utility. The end goal is I want to be able to come back into Form 1 here. In every place in the code that I reference XML user utility, I want to change that to be iUser utility. And then I'm going to add one method that I can modify that decides whether I'm using the XML provider or utility or I'm using the SQL utility. So that we have now this idea of interchangeable parts. So that's the end goal. That's what we're striving to do. So if we jump back to our Solution Explorer, go to Mod 5 SQL Data Access Layer, and we open up the SQL user utility, we've gone ahead and we've done an implicit implementation of our members, but they're all blank. There's no implementation. To do any work with SQL, at minimum you need 3 objects. And there's different ways to do the implementations, but typically you need a minimum of 3 objects. A connection object that actually manages the connection to the SQL database. A command object, which is your SQL statement that you want to execute. And then we have to get back results. You get back what's called a SQL data reader, and it allows you to read the data from your query, from the command that you ran. So the way that I like to approach it is I like to create myself some private methods that are kind of my helper methods. So the first one I always create is called getConnection. And the objects that we're wanting to use are going to be geared specifically towards SQL Server. And those live under system.data.SQL client. And then what we're wanting is a SQL connection. Okay? Now I made the comment before about interfaces, and you're going to see the use of interfaces when we start talking about SQL. SQL connection, if I jump back out to MSDN, hit F1 after I select the class, that is not the documentation I was looking for. F1. Okay, guess I'll just... This doc will show you that SQL connection inherits an object called DB connection. If we jump to the DB connection class, we'll see that DB connection implements an interface called IDB connection. IDB connection has all of the methods and properties that any object within the .NET framework needs in order to implement what's referred to as the ADO.NET, or basically the database access layer of the .NET framework. So now the SQL implementation obviously is built right into the .NET framework. Older versions of the framework included an Oracle implementation. They were removed. There's an ODBC implementation and an OLEDB implementation. So if you ever experienced either one of those, you can go out on the net and you can download, published by Oracle, their implementation of the Oracle data access components. Those classes that you download that come in a DLL implement iConnection, iCommand, and iDataReader. You can go out and download a MySQL implementation, and those classes also implement iConnection, iCommand, and iDataReader. The reason for that is that you can write your code in a way Where it's generic, it's not keyed or geared toward a particular SQL server, SQL piece of software, but instead you're just writing against generic connection systems. So you can write a piece of software that says, I don't care what kind of database you're connecting me to, whether it's SQL or Oracle or MySQL, I'll be able to connect to that system by simply utilizing these interfaces and maybe one or two functions that do all of the logic and decision making for you. So that makes your application very streamlined, makes your application very versatile, allows your program to port from platform to platform very quickly and easily. So the interfaces really do provide you a lot of value, especially when you start getting into enterprise-based systems. So to create a connection object, it's as simple as saying and I could even do that on one line if I wanted to. So you may be thinking, well, what's all the fuss? Why do you create a method? Well, first of all, if I was just dealing with those two lines, and there's more, but if I was just dealing with those two lines, I'd have to write those two lines in each one of the four public methods that I'm implementing. Not a big deal. But what happens if those two lines require more code to actually get the connection working? You'd have to go back and touch all four copies of these two lines and add that second or third or fourth line. So instead, by putting it in a function and calling that function, any more work that needs to be added to getting a connection, you add it in one place and it updates the entire system. So in order to get the connection to work, we actually need what's called a connection string. Now the string is vendor specific or product specific, however you want to look at it. It actually can even be version specific depending on what version of SQL Server or any database you're using. So it's always important to remember that they need to be updated appropriately. If you don't remember your connection strings for some reason, and I'll be honest, except for SQL Server, I don't typically memorize connection string formats, you can go out to connectionstrings.com and they have pretty much every single connection string format you could think of. So if we scroll down, there's a SQL Server option. We are dealing with the .NET Framework data provider. And then we are dealing with, this is 2008. And the one that we're looking for is this first one. And it simply takes the server name, the database name, and then trusted connection equals true. And the reason for that is because we're using SQL Express, and we just use our local credentials. And that's why you say trusted connection equals true. It'll just use your local machine credentials to authenticate you to the SQL Server. If you're using an instance where there's a username and password, maybe in a more public setting, basically where the SQL Server is on a different machine than your own, you would use the standard security model, which includes a username and password. So we'll go ahead and steal this line here, copy, and we'll say connection string equals that. So for me, my machine lives at local/SQL Express. My database will be 15ss-cp, and my connection will be true. Any problems you see with this line of code?
You saw semicolon after true and like before the quote?
Yes, so the connection string format itself requires semicolons after each segment. So server name, actually you put 2 slashes there. Server equals localhost / SQL Express. That's a segment of the connection string. Database equals the name of the database, semicolon. That's a segment of the connection string. Trusted connection equals true, semicolon. All of that is inside of the string though. So as far as the compiler is concerned, it's just a string with a semicolon in it. It's no different than if you wrote a sentence that contained a semicolon. It doesn't know. The semicolon at the end is the line completion, the C# line completion. Two slashes because I need a slash there, and in order to escape the slash inside of the string, I have to do 2. So what happens if my database changes? What do I have to go through to fix my database? To change and point my app to a new database?
No, you just change the database in your phone.
Connection string?
Yes.
Okay. Which is fine as long as I'm the only person using the app. So what happens if there's 10 copies of the app on each one of these machines? Or each machine has a copy of the app. Then how do I update the connection string? Yeah.
You would maybe want to store everything to like a local file, and every time the program launches it reads it from the file, so it would read the specific database name.
Correct. So that way you update the file instead of having to rebuild your entire app and redeploy it. Within .NET, people at Microsoft already thought of that. There's an app config file. It's an XML document that stores your application config. It's pretty sparse by default, but you can add to it. Within Visual Studio, there's IntelliSense. So if you do an open caret, it'll give you all the different options. Connection strings is one of those options. Open caret again, there's an add. Space. The 2 properties we're going to worry about today, 2 attributes technically, are connection string and name. The name is the name internally that your program will use to reference this line, and then the connection string obviously is the connection string used to connect. So the name I'm going to give this is SQL User Utility. And the connection string will be this connection string. Without the double slash. Just as a point of reference, there's a 3rd attribute that you can use called provider name. And that attribute is used in detecting what class library needs to be used to create the connection object. And there's functionality built into the framework that'll use that 3rd attribute to generate your connection object for you, whether it be Oracle or SQL or MySQL or so forth. And if you're curious, it's system.data.sql in our case. But we won't really be using it. All right, so we have our connection string in place. It's called SQL User Utility, just like our class name. So now within this class library, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a reference from my assemblies. And what I'm looking for is system.configuration. System.configuration gives me a utility called a configuration manager. That utility class allows me to quickly and easily access data out of the app config. So by bringing that in, I can simply say system.configuration.configuration manager .connection strings, square bracket, and then ask for either an index or the name. The name is the name of our connection string dot connection string. I'm going to add a using statement and shorten that up. There we go. So now if our database connection changes, we go into our app config, make one change, and we're done. I'm expecting that you do this in your app when you submit your final, because your SQL server will be different than my SQL server. So unless your SQL server is public, perhaps on the UC network somewhere, they will be different because I will have my copy of AdventureWorks loaded on my machine, you'll have your copy on yours. I expect to go in here and change your server name to my server name and then be done. I'm not going to dig through your app and find every copy of the connection string that's in there and change them all. All right. So let's do an easy one just to kind of kick the tires. So we'll do get all users. So first of all, I will do SQL connection, con equals get connection. And then I'll need a SQL command. And you can do new command, or the connection has a property called create command. I'd recommend using that one. It creates the command object that is the pair to the connection object, so you don't always have to worry about what kind of connection object you're dealing with. And it automatically assigns this connection object to be the connection that the command executes on. So it's two birds with one stone. SQL data reader, which will be our reader. So we've now got our three variables or objects in place. So the first thing we want to do is on the command, we want to set the command text property. And this command text will be our SQL that we're going to execute against the server. The next thing that we want to do is we'll want to do an execute, and in this case we're going to execute reader. Execute reader will return to us a SQL data reader object, which I'll store in my reader variable. Oh, before that, we have to open the connection. Then we have to read our data. So to do this, we do while reader.read we'll build our user objects, and then we'll say con.close, and then return our collection of users. You should see some similarities to what we did with the XML. So I'm going to add one more variable up here, which will be my list of users. So now we actually need a database with a users table. Within Visual Studio, you can use, if you go View, and not Solution Explorer, but Server Explorer. You can open that, say Connect Database, SQL Server, Continue, and then again, mine is local/SQL Express. If I drop down here, I'll get a list of all the databases that are currently loaded on my system. I'm going to create a new one called 15ss-cp. I'm going to hit OK. Visual Studio will ask me if I want to create that database. I'll say yes. It'll create that database for me. It'll build the connection. And now I have kind of a mini version of Microsoft SQL Management Studio. So I want to add a table, right click, add table. It'll pull up a designer. While that's loading, I'm just going to go ahead and start. First name, varchar max. Last name, varchar max. Email, varchar max. Password, varchar max. I'm going to change this to a GUID. Or I'm sorry, they call it a unique identifier. And then I want to modify the property of this column to make it an identity column. So under the properties for that column, identity specification is identity, set it to true. And then to actually push this table into my database, I click the update button. No, since it's an identity, I can't make it a GUID. So we'll leave it as an int. I'll do an update. It'll generate the script to actually create the table. I'll say update database, and it'll actually push that table into my database. Okay. So if I go to my Server Explorer, if I hit the little refresh here, I now have my users table.